Dune Awakening could be the first real survival crafting MMO, and it could be incredibly successful. But does it hit all the right notes? Quick little bit of housekeeping. I was invited to the content creator press preview, and it's worth considering that this isn't the full game. It's about 25 hours worth of content, not the final version of the game either. So that means that there could be bugs and stuff like that won't be in the game when it actually comes out. You'll actually get to play this game though in the beta weekend coming May 9th. Okay, let's jump into the game. The character creator is pretty decent. I didn't really play with this too much. It's actually something you can mess around with now on Steam. It's already out, the character creator. The interesting thing here though is that you will get to pick a home planet and some lore options about your character. These, as far as I can tell, give you extra dialogue in certain conversations, but I don't really know if it matters that much. You will also pick your class, and this does matter, but it is actually just more of a preset. For example, you can actually learn everything in the game, pretty much no restrictions. So the classes are Mentat, Swordmaster, Bene Gesserit, and Trooper. But if you start off as a Swordmaster, you can still learn everything as a Trooper. There are no real restrictions in that. You're not going to make a wrong choice and then never be able to recover it, which I think is good. The story is pretty nicely told. The cutscenes are great. I'm not in this video going to spoil any of the story because I don't think that's super appropriate, but I do like the cutscenes. The game's tutorial, I think, is also pretty good. It does a good job leading you through the starting experience, from crafting your first knife, learning how to make bandages, climbing. It tells you about the heat exhaustion and water and all that kind of stuff. It also tells you through the combat basics, which are a little bit melee focused in the tutorial, but that will obviously open up as the game expands. The tutorial is basically you going into this like crash ship and calling down a beacon or something like that. Once you're done with that little bit of a tutorial, you end up going into the Hagar Basin for real. Your ship, I think, basically crashes, and the first thing you've got to do is run away from your crash ship because there's a big worm trying to eat you. So it eats the ship, and then you stumble onto the rocks, and you're like, okay, now the game actually really begins, and you start in the Hagar Basin south. The worm, by the way, is an ever-present danger, something you're always going to want to keep an eye out on. And for me, it's actually an exhilarating part of the game, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. This is where the game turns into a proper survival crafting experience. Yes, it is a little bit on rails in terms of the fact that there's a tutorial, but you could basically do whatever you wanted. If you had a friend here, they could in theory come and pick you up and take you wherever you wanted to go. Even in this version, I think you could probably expand a bike to have an extra seat, so somebody could come and get you, even though it's not the full game. I'm sure at some point you'll have even more advanced vehicles. Anyway, the survival crafting elements are pretty standard, right? You've got to build your base. You've got to start powering it up and protect it against the sandworm. Don't build your base on the open sands, because that will mean the worm will come and get you. You do most of this by obviously gathering materials. Now, the way you gather is sort of twofold. A lot of the times you can just run around and press E and pick stuff up, but if you want to get anything in serious quantities, then you have to actually go to a node. There are different types of nodes. There are metal nodes, fuel cell nodes, and then ore nodes, so different kinds of metal and stuff like that. To gather the ones from the nodes, you pretty much need a tool, and that tool is the cut array. And it has like this fun little game where you scan the object first, and then you cut down the line. I enjoyed that, to be honest. Might get a little bit repetitive, but I think like vehicles will expand upon that later on. To craft anything though, you typically need two things. You're going to need to have the item research, so you actually know how to craft it. This is in the form of something called intel, and effectively like a research tree. The more you research, the more you can research, if that makes sense. You have to work your way from top to bottom, from the lower tier items like copper items to whatever the hell the last one is. It's got a silly name that I'm not going to remember. Intel you get from playing the game, and also there's intel locations on the map that you go to and sort of kill everybody and then find the item, and then you get the intel. That's what you need for researching, and it's going to be pretty important in the game. As well as knowing how to craft it, obviously you need the materials that, as we just spoke about, you go gathering those. You'll start out actually building your base. The base building is pretty decent. You can create a lot of different things if you want to. I'm sure that's going to get very exciting. I would say that the actual crafting menu is a little bit awkward. There's like these different themes that you can cycle between later on, and if you accidentally press, I think, like Q or R, you can end up in an area of the game you just don't know what you're doing. It's not particularly intuitive, but I think once you've played a lot, you'll get the hang of it. You basically just build a very small base, and you do this by putting down this, I think it's called a sub-thief. I think I may have got the name wrong, but that basically says this is your area. And in it, you'll put like this fuel generator, and you'll add fuel cells to it. That keeps your shields in your base up, which means the sandstorm doesn't come and delete it. One of the first things you'll end up building will be a blood purifier. Before you actually do the blood purifier though, you'll want to go and kill some scavengers. So it'll tell you to build like a pair of binoculars, tell you to scout some scavengers, go and kill them, and then eventually you'll do the same thing again, but you'll actually extract the blood. You can do this with the melee, as I said. It will have you build this like mauler pistol, but we'll talk more about weapons in just 1 second. Don't get attached to this first base though, because you will be deleting this base as you move around the map. It's actually part of the quest to delete this base at some point. Okay, let's talk about the systems in a little bit more depth. Let's talk about combat. At first, each class basically is going to start with 1 ability. Eventually you'll end up with 3 abilities and the ability to like get spice infused. Your ability is going to be class dependent at the start though. As I said, your class is not forever. For example, you can unlock the trooper first abilities relatively easily and early on in the game. I think you actually just go to the Griffin's trade post and do a quest there. There are 2 tiers to class trainers though. There's the basic one that unlocks most of it, and then there's an advanced one that unlocks the ultimate ability and sometimes the tier 2 of some abilities. There's also an extra kind of like talent tree called the Planicologist, who is actually in the starting area of the Hagar Basin. He's not necessarily a class per se, but it is a talent tree with like things that you might want. I would say that combat, I think, is a little bit more dynamic than it first appears. Early on, you're going to just start with your dagger and your mauler pistol, and that's going to be fine for enemies that don't have shields, but you will start encountering enemies that do have shields, and for that you're going to initially need melee. As per the tutorial, the way you're going to deal with these melee attackers when they have shields is that you're going to try and stagger them and then do I keep calling it a heavy attack, but it's actually the slow blade, right? You've got to do a slow attack so it penetrates the shield. If they don't have a shield, you can just left click them to death and the game will effectively like track on the enemy that you're looking at. When you do come against enemies that have shields, you can't really just use your mauler pistol. In theory, you can eventually knock down shields. In practice, you're going to want a more heavier gun than the mauler pistol to do that. So you'll use melee. You will, however, by doing the quest later on, get a quest that'll say, hey, make this gun. And there's a gun, I think it might be called the Disruptor. That Disruptor will then knock down the shields. It will do less damage to people once the shield is down, but you can actually just keep shooting them once the shield's down anyway. So if you are a rangedy boy, you will have ways of getting through shields. That is not just simply going up to them and, staggering them and then meleeing them. I think eventually you get like a shotgun where the bullet itself kind of like hits the shield and then slowly goes through it and then explodes. I didn't actually get to play with that because it was locked, but just reading it, that's sort of what it sounds like. There might be extra things that mess with shields. I didn't really get into it too much on that level. But yeah, for some people, it might be a bit of an issue that you're going to have to melee. For me, that's not a problem. I enjoy melee. It's kind of my vibe. But just for some people, it might be an issue. I also took the Swordmaster because of that very reason. And I'd say the knee charge ability is really cool. But there's other abilities like Compel, if you're aware for the Bene Gesserit. There's like a grappling hook. And if I'm honest, I don't know what the other starting ability is, so I'm just going to skip over this and pretend we never said it. Eventually, though, you can just pick and choose at will, learn whatever abilities you want, and make your combination. And I think that's going to be really interesting. And also a little bit more dynamic than what some of the dev videos have shown. I found the combat to be a little bit more enjoyable than what they'd presented it as. I would say that at times it does feel a little bit clunky, kind of hard to explain, but it just doesn't feel always very smooth. And sometimes the NPCs are a little bit brain, they're just not very smart. Again, preview build, not final, let's keep that in mind. And I did kind of find myself getting a little bit overran when there were multiple enemies. Like if there were multiple shield enemies, it's kind of hard to deal with that, right? Because you need to stagger one and then do a slow blade. But while you're doing that, another one is also trying to hit you. Multiple enemies, yeah, a bit of a bane for me. I do think the combat is going to be a big subject. I think it's probably better than a lot of other survival crafting games, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's absolute top tier, at least not yet. Maybe it gets better though. I think it probably does get better the more advanced you get. Okay, let's jump a little bit back into the way that you survive in this game, because I briefly spoke about heat and water and stuff like that, but let's talk about them in a little bit more detail. The heat is actually kind of simple. It's a bar that when you hit the red, you start losing water, and then when you lose water, you basically start losing health. If you had infinite water, you could kind of power through the heat exhaustion, but obviously that's not practical. So you don't stay in the sun, you stay in the shade, or you're at night. For water, there's a few ways of getting water. I spoke about like taking blood for your enemies, but initially it's going to be like sucking up the water from these plants, and that'll fill your bar to about 1/3. You can't go beyond that by just sucking on plants. That's where the recycled blood comes in. And then eventually you can get a like tier 2 version of the blood purifier, get a better extractor, get better blood bags. And I think eventually there's this thing, I don't know what it was called. It was called like a death suit or death still. I don't know exactly what it was called. but it sounds like you're going to be able to bring a body to your base and extract the entire amount of water from the blood of an entire body. That sounds wild, but yeah. But there's other ways of getting water. You also can get like a dew collector. That's with a D, by the way, not with a J. And what that does is that you go over to these plants when it's nighttime, and the little moisture that's coming off them, you can collect them and put them into your containers. You can actually just have water containers on you so that if you are running out of water, you can drink it. You can deposit that from your blood purifier or a completely bigger, different type of water container that you can just put in your base that literally just stores water. Yeah, like water management is going to be important because for some crafts it also needs water. So water is going to be very present, at least in the early part of this game. I think once you get to the end game, you're going to have so many different ways of getting water and it's going to be so much more efficient. Probably going to be less of an issue. But early on, this is something you want to pay attention to like all the time. The base building itself is fine. For the walls and stuff like that, you actually use granite, which is like an ever-present material all across Arrakis, or at least the Haga Basin. But the machines inside, they'll use metal, and then eventually they'll start using like copper ingots and then iron ingots. And there's sort of like a whole tier list of the materials. In the preview, I think we only get up to iron, but then I think it goes steel and then some names that I don't actually remember the name of because I don't think they're normal English. But you'll need like a few basic machines at the start. You'll have your fuel generator, you'll have your blood purifier, you'll have a fabricator that you need to craft things like weapons. You can craft basic stuff from your character, like a basic knife and a basic cutter ray, but you know, if you want to craft anything serious business, then you need a fabricator in your house. And I actually think there's going to be different types of fabricator for more advanced stuff. You'll need an ore refinery to convert your ore into ingots. Then there'll be repair stations and all kinds of jazz, right? I do think the building is pretty serviceable. As I said, though, there is a little bit of a concern for me with the UI. I think sometimes it can get a little bit sketchy, but overall, I think people will go wild with that. People will, you know, be saving their blueprints, selling their blueprints, and, you know, having a great time. One big survival element, which I don't want to downplay in any way because it is pretty meaningful, and I already spoke about it a bit, is the worm. Shai Hulud, or whatever it's called from the film. I have now watched the first film. Still definitely not an expert on the Dune lore, though. But the worm is like a horror film, basically. Every time you run across the open desert, there's a chance that this big giant worm is going to come lock onto you and kill you. Now, I never died to the worm. I never got any footage, which I kind of regret not doing. But I believe you pretty much lose everything that you have on you when you die to the worm. And triggering the worm, well, there's a few different ways of triggering the worm. But effectively, when you're in the sand, there'll be like this bar, and the more red it gets, the more the worm is paying attention to you. The worms, I think, are actually pretty cool. They are actually in the world. Like, they don't just appear. They have to come from a different place, and if there's one really close to you, then you'll trigger it really quickly, and if there's not, maybe you'll have a bit more time. They might even have slightly different like personalities. I think in the starter zone they might be a little bit less aggressive, and then in the second zone it felt like they were a little bit more aggressive because there has to be, but because you're on vehicles instead. I don't know if that's actually true. It's just the way that it kind of, I think that I may have heard that and it kind of felt like that. But yeah, running across the sand, oh, it's scary, it's exhilarating, and a little bit stressful. But it's kind of stress that you can pick. Doing so at night is recommended if you're going to do a big crossing. You're basically playing a game of Tremors where you're going from rock to rock. I kind of like it. I think it's a unique element. I think it works. When the music swells, it's super intense. Normally if you die in PvE, you just run back and pick up your bag. If the worm gets you though, I think everything's gone. I'll talk about PvE, PvP in a minute though. There's other things that will trigger the worm. For example, shields will trigger the worm. A thumper will trigger the worm. Getting the sandflower and spice off the sand, yeah, that's going to trigger the worm as well. As you complete the game though, as you get all of the basic stuff up and built and ready, you'll eventually get to do a spice trial. And I'm not going to spoil this, but these spice trials, they're just little kind of like areas that you go to, do a little kind of like story-based quest, and then eventually it'll probably unlock something for your character. Once you've done that though, the game will send you to your first contact with civilization. The Griffin's trade post is where you'll start seeing actual NPCs, probably other players as well. Here you can pick up contracts, which are a type of quest, and there are different types of quests. There's a vendor that you can buy and sell to. There's no auction house in this preview, but I think there probably is in cities because I think part of this game is going to be PvEers collecting stuff and selling them to PvPers. But again, we'll touch on that later. And I really do think that this kind of sets Dune apart from other survival crafting games. Of course, other survival crafting games have quests, but for me, for some reason, the quests in Dune really do feel like MMO quests. I don't know if it's just me, but it really did start to feel like an MMO. Right, I'm not going to define here what is and what isn't an MMO, what's an MMORPG, etc. That conversation is just going to be really boring, I think, and also we'll get a trillion different answers. But it felt like an MMO because when I was running around, I would see other people's bases, I'd see other people running around with me. But is it massive? Well, let's quickly talk about the server structure. There's going to be several different worlds is the term that they're using. A world is effectively like your traditional server. If you want to have friends, you want to play with each other, you've got to be on the same world/server. And then whilst you're in your world, there's going to be different parts of the map. There's going to be a deep desert, Haga Basin, different cities, Landsrad. I think, I actually don't know if that's a different place or not. I'm not sure. But there's different kind of like areas of the world. Now, these are completely separate though. It's not like you can just walk between one. You have to get in a vehicle and fly, and it's a completely different instance. However, there's only one version of the deep desert. I never got to try the deep desert, but that's what we know, right? There's only one version of the deep desert. But the Haga Basin, there's actually multiple different versions of them called Sietches. Basically, these are servers/layers. We can both be in the same place, but if you're on a different siege or a different layer, then I'm not going to see you. You won't see your friends, for example, either. Now, this Haga Basin will only be around about 40 to, I think we also heard around about 60 players. The official infographic seems to say 40 plus. So I don't know exactly how many it is. So I would say for me, 40 plus isn't necessarily an MMO, but the deep desert is going to be maybe like 1,000. And I'd say that will feel like an MMO. I never got to experience that in this preview of the build because it was literally just 25 hours of the Haga Basin, but I think it's kind of an MMO. Just seeing people running around and building bases, it gave me that MMO vibe. It might not be an MMO to you. That's fine. I'm not going to try and convince you. If you don't think it is, it's not. Fine, great. Once you've been to Griffin's Reach, you start getting more quests. They'll send you around the map. First, it sends you to a PvE crash ship, and we'll talk about that in a second as well. Then I think it sends you to the Eco Lab. And the whole thing here is trying to get parts for your bike. And once you get your bike, you go across the Vermilius Gap, I believe it's called, which is a big gap of sand, which if you run on foot, you're going to get eaten by the worm. But when you do it on your bike, you're going to have a very intense traversing method where the worm is very much on your tail, but hopefully you'll just make it across. I don't know if you can die there. Like if you like do something wrong, will it kill you? Or is it like a cinematic thing? I don't know, but it was very intense either way. Crafting your bike, by the way, is you get these pieces from different parts of the map. You have a specific tool that you use to craft bikes. You put it all together. Bob's your uncle. You end up with a vehicle. You need to make sure it's repaired. You need to make sure it's fueled. And yeah, you travel around the map a lot faster. The first part of the game, the Haga Basin South, feels a little bit like a running simulator, except it feels like Tremors. There's a lot of running involved. Once you get your bike, that kind of dissipates a little bit. And then I think once eventually you get, you know, a bigger vehicle like I keep calling it the Hornicopter, the Ornicopter, whatever it's called. I'm just going to call it the Hornicopter. Once you get that, I think traveling will be even easier. Kind of like progression in that sense. And to be fair, progression feels good. Once you get across the Vermilius Gap, you're effectively doing almost all of the same things you were doing, but you're now doing it in a higher tier. Things are more powerful. There's more options. You can create different weapons. You can create higher tier stuff, tier 2 versions of things, tier 3 versions of things. Yeah, you get a shield for combat as well, so that, you know, you don't get shot at by bullets, which completely changes combat, because when you're shooting, your shield drops, but if you're not shooting, you're trying to melee, then people shooting you have to deplete your shield first. There's like things that help you when you're falling. There's a whole lot to it that expands once you hit the Vermilius Gap. You'll learn about the compacting and the harvesting of sandflower and spice. Try doing that in the open desert though, and the worm's going to come for you, so you kind of want to get in and out, and yeah, it's exhilarating, I think. The Vermilius Gap, once you get across it, is where you, I think, get a real feel for what the game's going to be. You've done all the tutorial. Now you've got to actually like do the progression. You've got to go and get your intel for your research. You've got to go to the eco labs for the quest. You've got to go to, I can't remember the name of the trading post. You've got to go to the trading post though, get your contracts and complete then. You've got to do the main story and find the AQLs and then complete the AQLs, which are those kind of like spice vision things. You've got to get the tier 2 of things, tier 3 of things. That's where the game like really starts. And you'll start really developing what you like as a character and as a player. Effectively, the Haga Basin South is copper, and then once you get in the Vermilius Gap, it becomes iron, and that's that tier. And then eventually you'll go out of that tier into another tier, and so far and so forth. I don't know how many tiers it's capped at, maybe like 5 or something. The deep desert, I assume, will have all the end game stuff. When you're in the Vermilius Gap though, you will actually get your first taste of PvP. Now don't worry, or don't get too excited depending on your point of view. PvP will happen at the crashed spaceships. Now, there's actually two types of crashed spaceships, which is a little bit weird and a little bit awkward to talk about. One of them is literally a spaceship that you will see, you know, hitting the ground. You'll actually see it crashing, and it'll be in the desert, and you can go over to it and I presume like salvage and get resources. I actually never went because it was way too risky, because that big thud, well, you better believe it, I think the worm's very interested in that. At those crash ships, I don't think there's PvP, but there's areas on the map that are like big ships, and they are PvP. When you go over there, it becomes like War of Assassins, and typically they have like a type of material that you need in certain kinds of things. I never saw anybody in the PvP zone. I didn't manage to get footage of trying it, but that's kind of like opt-in, right? You don't have to do it to get those materials, but maybe you want to. Maybe you'll see people, maybe you won't. You can obviously just avoid it if you want to. The Haga Basin, I think, is probably something like 95, if not 99% PvE. The Deep Desert, though, I think is going to flip that on its head. I think the Deep Desert is probably going to be 99% PvP. And I think that fact where the first 100 hours are going to be like PvE, the rest of the end game is basically going to be PvP. Yes, they talk about how you can actually see people come in and fly away, but I think for a lot of people, that's going to be very confusing and it's going to put people off. It's kind of disjointed. It's kind of like two different games in a sense, or at least that is what it sounds like, right? I never did the Deep Desert. I never experienced that, but that's what I believe, right? That's what the devs said, so that's the way I think it's going to go. I'm just kind of worried about the leveling being PvE and then the end game being PvP. Maybe I have nothing to worry about. Maybe I'll only find out when the game's out. Maybe I'll enjoy the PvP. I don't know. It's going to be a big question though, I think. Now, it's also worth noting that the build that I played, as I've said a couple of times now, is not the final build, right? It's a preview. It didn't have all the content. And there were some bugs. I had a bug where I wasn't sitting right on my bike several times. Like sometimes I was way off to the side or way off to the front. I somehow got off my bike at a weird time and ended up under the mountain. The NPCs occasionally will just stand there. And you know, sometimes it's a bit jank. Again, not the final build. They have, I think, maybe like over a month now to fix this. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. Hopefully it'll be ready in time. I think overall though, it was kind of okay. The performance was okay. Nothing really ruined my experience. And overall, I would say with the game, I enjoyed the time that I played. And I am looking forward to the full game. It feels like a real survival crafting MMO. And I know we have a bit of a problem with the massive part of that MMO phrase, but that's what it felt like when I was playing it. The combat is decent enough. The game is pretty beautiful at times. Might be a little bit repetitive in the deserts. That's broken up a little bit by the eco labs, but you know, it is mostly just sand dunes. But yeah, overall, I actually had fun. I am worried about the PvP endgame. I know the argument's going to be that you can go and farm the PvE and then sell it to the PvPers, but if you're doing that at a massive disadvantage to the PvPers, why would you keep doing that as a game? I don't think that would be very enjoyable for you when there's other games where PvEs could actually just play the game that they want. But maybe it'll be a very successful PvP game. I mentioned that you can try the beta. I believe the beta, and I think it's going to be effectively the same version that we played, not necessarily without any like bug patches, but the same content. I think that's going to be playable the 9th of May, and if you want to come and check me out playing it, I will be doing that live on Twitch. You can make your own impressions though and play it yourself. You can also check in the description below, because on my other channel, I am going to be making Dune Awakening videos. Guides, impressions, all that kind of jazz. In fact, the first video I'm going to do is literally just mostly unedited footage. If you want to watch the first hour and an hour and a half of this game, I'm right there. I've got you. It's me kind of doing like a stream, except I'm talking to myself. I've got a little few edits at the start, but most of the game is unedited and you can just watch the gameplay. You can also watch some streams. There are some people who are going to be doing streams, I think, as this goes live. Right, I've still not finished Dune Part 2. I should probably do that. Let me know your thoughts. Have a most beautiful day. Like and subscribe. Goodbye.